Sharing of witness D19, Desert Night, as told to me by Chris, a witness who wished to remain anonymous. I met Chris in a quiet roadside diner, the kind of place where the coffee is cheap and the locals eye strangers warily. We sat in the very corner so as not to draw others' attention. He agreed to talk, but only after making sure no one was listening. His hands fidgeted with the napkin, and his eyes kept drifting toward the door. "This happened years ago," he said, "but I still don't feel safe talking about it." He told me his story carefully, like he was choosing which parts to say out loud. I listened in total concentration, preventing myself from any unnecessary interruptions. With Chris's approval, I am recounting his experience. Chris had always loved night hikes. He liked the way the desert stretched out under the moon, endless and empty. It was his vast, peaceful escape from daily concerns. He had taken this trail more times than he could count. That night, something felt different. It started with the silence, he explained. No wind, no crickets, no distant coyote howls. Just a dense, unnatural quietness, like the desert had just stopped breathing. Then the feeling, that prickling sensation at the back of his neck, like unseen eyes locked onto him. He wasn't alone. At first he tried to ignore it, chalking it up to exhaustion. Chris had been walking for nearly an hour when he noticed his shadow. It stretched too far in front of him. The moon was behind him, meaning his shadow should have stayed at a normal length. But this one was behaving unnaturally. The path ahead wound through a narrow canyon, and the jagged cliffs cast deep pockets of darkness. But something was wrong with those shadows. They shifted when he wasn't looking. His first thought was that it was a trick of the moonlight, but then it moved. Not with him. On its own. Chris stopped. His shadow kept walking. His breath hitched, his stomach knotting tight. Then, as if it had noticed him noticing, it snapped back into place, normal again. "Just keep walking," he muttered, forcing himself forward. Then the footsteps started, not his own. A second pair, soft, careful. Chris tested it. He stopped. The footsteps stopped. He took 3 quick steps forward, then paused. So did they. He tried slowing down, speeding up, and stopping abruptly. The second pair of steps mirrored his perfectly, always a half beat behind. Like it was waiting. His pulse hammered in his ears. His breath came faster. He wasn't imagining this. Chris turned his head slightly, just enough to glance over his shoulder. The trail behind him was empty. He started walking again, faster this time. The footsteps followed. The longer Chris tells me his story, the more his face blends with the white color of the wall behind him. His skin went ice cold. In front of him the canyon narrows, walls pressing in tight, a natural choke point. That's when he realized it wasn't following him. It was herding him. Chris swallowed hard. His eyes flicked toward the canyon walls. If this thing wanted him to go somewhere, it meant he absolutely should not go there. So he did the only thing he could think of. He stepped off the trail. The footsteps stopped. Then the air changed. It felt thicker, heavier. The weight of the desert pressed in on him. And then, low and hollow, something clicked. Not a sound exactly. A realization. Chris's fingers, which have been crumpling the napkins the entire time, now remain motionless. Suddenly he hears, "Are you lost?" Chris turned. He didn't see it clearly at first, just a sliver of something pale peeking from behind a boulder. Then another, and another. Then it stepped into the moonlight. His breath caught. It was tall, thin, too thin. Its limbs were wrong bent at strange angles, like it had spent too long crawling on all fours. And its face, almost human but stretched too thin, eyes hollow and too large. It was smiling. Then it spoke again, his own voice. A perfect hollow copy. Chris didn't hesitate. He ran. He didn't know which way. He just ran. The thing followed. Its steps didn't match his anymore. They were faster, closer. And then the whisper, right against his ear. Hissing, strong but incomprehensible. Cold fingers grazed the back of his neck. Chris screamed. He ran faster, lungs burning, legs aching, but he could hear it the whole time. Breathing, the slap of its feet against the stone. Too light, too fast. Then a howl, not from the thing, from somewhere else. Deep, ancient, not human. Chris didn't stop running, but the thing did. He didn't question it. He just kept going. Then the drums, a deep rhythmic pounding in the distance. He barely registered where he was going until he stumbled into the clearing. A circle of large stones, old and half-buried, etched with something too worn to read. Chris collapsed in the center, chest heaving, barely able to breathe. The drums, he could feel them, pounding through the ground beneath him, thrumming in his bones. And just beyond the circle, standing at the edge of the dark, it watched him, but it wouldn't step forward. The thing lingered there, just beyond the stones, shifting its weight from foot to foot. It wanted to step closer. Chris could feel it, but it couldn't. The drumming grew louder and stronger. The air around him buzzed with something he didn't understand. And then, it was gone. Chris never saw it leave. One moment it was there, the next just empty desert. He stayed in that stone circle until sunrise, until the desert felt normal again. Only then did he stand on shaky legs and walk back to his truck. Chris never hiked alone at night again. He rubbed his hands together as he finished, staring at the table between us. His knuckles were white. I wanted to ask if he ever found out what the drums were, if he had been saved or warned. But something about his face stopped me. His eyes were dark with something I could only describe as pure fear. I didn't want to push him, so I changed the topic. I saw how small distraction eases his face. We talked for about the next hour about many trifles, not important from our point of view. At the end, Chris glanced at the diner window, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. He frowned, finished his coffee, then stood. "I've already said too much," he muttered. A few crumpled bills hit the table, and then he was gone, driving off quickly. As Chris hurried out of the diner, I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. The guy was rattled, no doubt about that. But was it real? I'd heard stories like this before, people swearing they saw something in the desert, something unnatural. It always followed the same beats. A shadow in the dark, footsteps that shouldn't be there, a narrow escape. A good campfire story. Still, something about the way Chris told it unsettled me. Not the fear in his voice, but the way he spoke as if he knew I wouldn't believe him, like he had already accepted that no one would. I wanted to believe it was just a story, a wild tale from a man who'd spent too many nights alone in the desert. But the way he told it, it didn't feel like someone was trying to scare me. It felt like someone was warning me. The way his voice wavered, not in exaggeration, but in reluctance, like he wasn't sure he should even be speaking about it. And then there was the way he looked at his own reflection. That moment stuck with me. It wasn't just unease, it was recognition, like he had seen something staring back at him that shouldn't have been there. I chuckled to myself, shaking my head. Maybe he had convinced himself of the story, or maybe, just maybe, he knew something I didn't. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the dry brush. The neon diner sign buzzed softly, flickering for just a second. I could have asked more questions, but maybe I didn't want the answers. Some things don't want to be talked about, and some stories, they follow you home.